with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So the writings, I'm going to kind of do this fairly quickly. I think the writings are, they're kind of blocked together on purpose. I'll give you a link to so our first seminar ever, this was about, I guess it was 3 years ago now, for our fall seminar was, like y'all did Mormonism, it was called The Middle of Your Bible. And so it was actually a whole seminar on these 5 books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. So there's about 8 hours of content that I'll be happy to get if you're really just curious and you want to know from a little bit higher level, higher critical level of how the Psalms came to be, and Proverbs, how do they fit in, a little bit more about Job, all of those. Song of Solomon is really interesting, the way that he kind of breaks it down too. So it's a guy named Jerry Lasser. He's a friend of mine. He has his PhD in Old Testament out at Southeastern, and so we flew him in, and he did that seminar for us. So we'll put that on Google Classroom. If Sloan can remind me of that, I'll get him that link, but that'll be just a resource for you. It's not going to be like on a test or anything, but if you do find yourself bored over the Christmas holiday and want to look up that, and he's for the subject matter, he's just he's pretty lighthearted, and so he kind of goes through it really well. All right, so that being said, I'm just going to we're going to hit some highlights of these books just to get our bearings about us. So if we go to Job, Job is one that we're probably more familiar with the story, and then we probably have the question, why the heck is Job such a long book? Because you get into Job, you get the whole story in about the first 2 chapters, and then you're stuck with like 40 chapters of what it seems like these just sayings after sayings, and you have his friends, who aren't very wise, speak in. And so in some ways, Job is set up like, I guess let's back up just real quick. So we talk about the writings. So these don't fit the narrative of Scripture, so to speak. They're not progressing the narrative of Scripture. That's not their goal or their intent. The writings, just sort of in a general sense, is centered around wisdom. That's the primary focus of writings. And so when we talk about the writings, the collection of books are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, depending on which translation you're working out of. And so with the writings, we just as a general sense, these aren't a part of the historical books, right? So you have the first 5 books of the Bible. They're called the what? So we're going to kind of go over broad categories real quick in Old Testament. First 5 books are Torah, Pentateuch, Law. Any one of those is usually just fine. Then after that, then you get from Joshua through 2nd Chronicles. Really, Joshua through Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Yeah, they're the historical books, okay? So that's where we've spent a lot of time. We spent a lot of time in the Pentateuch. Then you have the writings, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. And then you have the prophets. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But major prophets and minor prophets are sort of secondary to the prophets. And so the writings is kind of its own category and its own bear. And so we're not really trying to progress the story so much as really hear wisdom in the midst of kind of life and how to go about doing that. So each book offers some wisdom in different areas and zones, which is why you often hear, especially Psalms and Proverbs of the Old Testament, those might be the 2 books that you're most familiar with in the Old Testament, because you would even have New Testaments that would have Psalms and Proverbs attached to it, and that would be like your whole thing, right? Because there's something about the wisdom that's being given there that's transferable from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, and you're not trying to get lost in Israel's history, but instead it's just godly wisdom. And we'll talk about that especially here with Psalms. But Job is one of these books that offers wisdom, but a lot of it is, a chunk of it is this sort of anti-wisdom by Job's friends. And so it kind of serves as a little bit of a, I don't want to say antithesis, that might be too strong, but it serves as sort of up against, so to speak, the wisdom of, say, a Proverbs when you hear the wisdom of Job's friends and those speaking into it. All right, so we know the story of Job. At least we're probably fairly familiar with it. Let me pick up in verse 6 of chapter 1 of Job. And we'll we'll fly by this, but one day the sons of God, right? We heard this expression in Genesis chapter 6. It's the same Hebrew expression there with the Nephilim and the sons of God came down to the daughters of man. Same thing, so we're still, that argument still holds right here as far as its uncertainty. So one day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. All right, lots happening theologically, right? What is, if anything, this is where we see Satan probably most explicitly active in the Old Testament as far as who he is, what he's trying to do. And we also learn a little bit of Satanology almost, right? We learn a little bit about the nature of the enemy as he is doing what? As he's going before the Lord and he has to submit to the Lord. That says a lot about the nature of this quote-unquote epic battle that we have between good and evil, that Satan has to have permission to go before the Lord and do all that Satan is doing. So if we keep reading, the Lord asked Satan, "Where have you come from?" From roaming through the earth. Satan answered, "And walking around on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" So again, it's not like Satan sought out Job. Who's the one who proposed Job? God. All right, so we have to remember who's controlling all the dice here and all the bad stuff that happens in Job's life. It's the Lord. At the hand of Satan, it is the Lord who is over even Satan in this. So let's see. No one else on earth is like him, a man perfect in integrity who fears God and turns away from evil. Verse 9. Satan answered the Lord, Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the work of his hands and his possessions, and have increased it in the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he owns, and he will surely curse you to your face. Very well, the Lord told Satan, everything he owns is in your power. However, do not lay a hand on Job himself. So Satan left the Lord's presence. One day, when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and reported, while the oxen were plowing and the donkeys grazing nearby, the Sabeans swooped down and took them away. So God has given and sort of relinquished power to Satan. Now Satan is using that power to bring a foreign people upon the household of Job's kids. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. He was still speaking when another messenger came and reported, God's fire fell from heaven, it burned the sheep and the servants and devoured them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. That messenger was still speaking when yet another came and reported. The Chaldeans formed 3 bands, made a raid on the camels and took them away. They struck down the servants and with the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you. He was still speaking when another messenger came and reported, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. Suddenly a powerful wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on the young people so that they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So 4 times in 4 totally different ways, this is what's happened. And then Job stood up and tore his robe and shaved his head. He fell on the ground and worshipped, saying, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. What a glorious response. Throughout all this, what does it say? Job did not sin or blame God for anything. One day the sons of God came again to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before the Lord. Then the Lord asked Satan, where have you come from roaming the earth? So this is like Act 2 at this point of the play, and walking around on it. And the Lord said, have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man perfect in integrity who fears God and turns away from evil. It's verbatim. Exactly what it said. And a lot of times in the wisdom literature, you'll find some parallels like this that are intentional. And they're intentional for emphasis many times. He still retains his integrity, even though you incited me against him to destroy him for no good reason. Skin for skin, Satan answered the Lord. A man will give up everything he owns in exchange for his life, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. Very well, the Lord told Satan, he is in your power, only spare his life. So he took everything from him. Now Satan comes back, it's like, yeah, but you didn't even touch him. So God's like, all right, touch him, but don't kill him. So Satan left the Lord's presence and infected Job with terrible boils from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery to scrape himself while he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, this is where wisdom, the anti-wisdom sort of begins to come in. Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. Now, I love my wife. But if I'm going through something to where I've lost everything and I've got boils all over me and I have broken a pot so that I might cut these things off, and she looks at me and says, why are you keeping your integrity? Curse God and die. We're going to have a talking, right? I mean, this is just because at this point, but she's looking at her husband. And really what the book of Job is going up against is people had the idea that bad stuff happens because you did bad. It was retribution of some kind. That the only reason you go through the bad things in life is because of somehow, we would call it karma or something like that. This is the mentality that Job's wife brings in, and especially Job's friends come in later and bring in. And then verse 10, you speak as a foolish woman speaks. He told her, should we accept only good from God and not adversity? You want to underline that verse right there. Should we only expect good from God and not adversity? I was reading in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 this week, and as I'm reading in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul begins, I think it's beginning in chapter 10, 11, 12. He starts to go over all that he has suffered for the sake of the gospel. There's a beautiful passage in there in 2 Corinthians where Paul says, look, I've been shipwrecked, I've been beat, I've been thrown in prison, and he starts, and what's crazy is, I think of that passage, and I think of a passage like in Philippians chapter 3, where Paul is giving sort of his credentials for being the most Hebrew of Hebrews, the Jew among Jews. He's got, he was a Benjaminite, circumcised on the 8th day, a Hebrew among Hebrews, a zealot, and he lists all his credentials in that way to sort of puff himself up and say, I had everything, yet everything is a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Jesus Christ my Lord. Then he turns over here in 2 Corinthians and sort of, he sets aside those credentials and he says, but if you want credentials as far as persecution, let me list those. And now he goes boom, 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 boom. And then at the end in 2 Corinthians 12, when he finishes that, he says, but in my weakness I know I am strong because it is the Lord working in me for his glory and for his fame. And we get a picture like Job. He says, well, wait, should we only accept good from God and not adversity? He understands this concept even pre-Christ, that the things that happen to us in life are not so that we might sit around and complain about them, but they're still to the praise and glory of God. Because even in our weakest point, the Lord can shine through that and show his strength through you, so you might be a beacon of light. And so you keep going. It says, throughout all this, again, what is it? Job did not sin in what he said. Some people have, so then what happens is you have these three friends and they come in and they start giving all this advice, and Job kind of goes back and forth. And I'm going to sort of, that's a massive summary of what goes on. But this, the book of Job, some people have said, well, Job sinned because he didn't trust God in the midst of all of this. Yet the question I have, and I think the question that you can come when actually reading the text is, did he sin? I mean, it makes it explicit that in all of this, what did Job do? He did not sin. He asked questions of why, but even when you see the question in chapter 1, it's not even a question. When you see this lament in chapter 1, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, but blessed be the name of the Lord. Even in a lament and a crying out, what is Job doing? He's still turning that to praise. So I think we need to be far more hesitant to say, oh yeah, Job did that, then he sinned and then God answered, is sort of what we see, at the end of the book of Job. Because my thinking is, I don't know if he did sin. And I can't really see it explicitly in the text. If anything, he's asking appropriate questions, and he does ask the question why, but his faith never wavers, his integrity never wavers. And you see that throughout the book. And what you actually find, I think, and there's sprinkles of this through the book, while Job's friends are offering their bad advice over and again, Job will sprinkle in wisdom and sort of begin to correct that thinking of who God is. So Job really is a deep book of theology, because it presents a God who is sovereign over all things, It presents an enemy who is who has ability, but is still submissive to God. And then it presents man's suffering, yet also man's ignorance in the midst of suffering. There's a lot that's packed into all that's going on. Now, we started our time together. If you remember, I read from Job 38 through 40 is where we started at the very first day of class. And so just for time's sake, I won't read that. But if you remember the rest of the story of Job, you go through, it's the three friends, and then it's the wife, and then he comes in, and then it's the three friends and the wife, and you see this kind of ebb and flow of an argument, and you get to the point to where Job I don't think he sins, but I think he's just in honest humanity going, why did this happen? And if you remember the Lord's response, what does he say? Yeah, where were you? He never answers the question why. Job never gets the answer to his question, according to Job. And that's actually encouraging, I think, to us. Because that now transcends to all of us as followers of God, as followers of the Lord. And when stuff happens to us, we may not ever get the question why, but I'll tell you what, Job got the answer to who. Who is the God behind all of the things? You may not know why you're going through what you're going through. You may not know why you've been through what you've been through, but I'll tell you that the God who's behind it all is totally immutable. He is unchanging, and he is a God who holds all things in his hands. Where were you? He begins to answer Job. Where were you when I created, boom, and then he just goes over the cosmos. Where were you when I created, and then boom, he goes to a zoo. He starts talking about all the different kinds of animals from the ostrich to the goat. Where were you when I did all that? Where were you when I did the boom? He goes to the landscapes. Over and over and over again, he never answers why, but he does answer who. And that should give us certainty that no matter what life might throw our way, we can learn from the wisdom of Job that God doesn't change. Did I share with you about there's a children's book about God being compared to the moon? Did I say that to you? I don't know if I have. I can't remember the name of the children's book. It's a recent one that came out, and I think it is beautiful in its simplicity. And there will be a sermon that will come one day from this concept. But this idea that comes from Job, the author basically creates a story of this father talking to his child about how the moon goes through different phases. But the book is called The Moon is Always Round. And what he says, look, sometimes we look up at the moon, and what do we see? We see some sort of crescent. We look up and we see, there's half of it. We look up and maybe the other side is showing. Every once in a while, we'll see the full moon. And so with the child's curiosity, he's naturally sort of asking, well, the moon that's up in the sky, like, does it change shapes? And the father goes, no. What we see is only a part of a moon that never changes shape. And he goes, that's the same with the Lord. Many times when life hits us, and there are suffering, and there are circumstances, and there are things that we can't explain, we're only getting a crescent. We're only getting half of the moon. But we have to remember that our Lord doesn't change. Just like the moon is always round, we serve a God who doesn't change. And though he may manifest himself in bits and pieces of what that moon is, we know that we serve a God who is perfect and immutable and unchanging. And in that beautiful simplicity, right? I mean, think about teaching the doctrine of immutability to a child. We can get it. That's what Job got. You're seeing all the circumstances, Job, but I assure you that I haven't changed and you weren't there in the beginning, and I will stay the constant one. So a lot of that. So Job lives wisely. He still suffers, but chooses to hope and wait for the renewal of all things. And I think that's a call for us. And I think it actually helps us that Job is righteous, and there's a question of even whether he sinned. Because I know in the circumstances when stuff happens in our life, I think we are prone to sin. And we're prone to question and get mad and angry at God or mad and angry at different things. And I think it's actually helpful to see somebody go through this and suffer well. Because even in his suffering well, he still has questions. That's just humanity. Yet God's still the same. All right, any questions on Job? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Hunter, can you throw me a water bottle? Go ahead. Uh-huh. Why do you think that's the case? Thanks. Okay. Okay. Sure. Okay. Yeah. I think it was to set Job up against the friends in a way that shows Job as righteous and the friends not. And so I think it's a way for God to say, you guys need to be more like him because he's the righteous one here. And then you have Job praying on behalf of them, so that I would say ultimately so that they might change their ways like that. I'd have to go back and look. I don't know if she did die. Did she? Yeah, I'm not sure. Oh, yeah, the rest of his family does, because I think the wife is the one who she offers that kind of advice as well. Any other questions? Okay, let's jump to Psalms. All right, Psalms is, again, one we're probably, maybe of all the Old Testament books, we might be the most familiar with, but I want to run over just sort of some of the technical side of Psalms because we usually just jump right in. Psalms is not a book, and this is where Job is still kind of a story. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon really aren't stories any longer. They're collections. For sure with Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes for the most part. And then Song of Songs, it's its own bear, so to speak. We'll get there. But so to understand Psalms, you kind of have to know a little bit of the technical stuff that's going on. So Psalms comes from the Greek word for music. It's not a novel. It's not a story. So the Greek word for music, that's where we get Psalms. Think of it like a photograph album, right? It's full of pictures that show us a variety of places in a land of spiritual experience. All right, so it's like you're flipping through a photo album that's not necessarily chronological, but it's giving us snippets of how to live out this good life, a life that follows the Lord with a variety of different kinds of emotions. The book is broken up into 5 books. All right, so with 5 books, does this work? No. That is dead. 5 books begins in chapter 1, then goes to, 1 through 41. Then at chapter 42 is the next book. Then 73, then 90, and then 107, yeah. And so it's broken up into 5 books. I'll tell you this, scholars have tried to figure out what's the reason for that. There are a lot of different theories, but there's really not anybody who can sit back and say, this is why there are 5 books and this is why they're ordered in such the way that they are. Truthfully, it's more like an anthology. What's an anthology? It's a collection. That's right. There's not necessarily there's not a main story. It's just a collection of psalms. And so, again, scholars have tried to figure out, well, are they ordered in certain ways to communicate a certain message? And there are a lot of different theories out, but there's not necessarily a consensus on that. It's a collection of independent writings. It's basically, let me make sure I got this right. So it's written over the course of 500 years. Most scholars would agree with that. Over 500 years, it's cohesive, yet it reflects various styles of poetry and writing and wisdom. So really this means, and this is probably the most important in this setup part, this means there are different kinds of psalms. Did I give you those different kinds in your notes? I don't know if I did. No, I think I just listed psalms. So this, if you're taking good notes, this might be where you can at least break down the different kinds of psalms. There's a lament psalm. All right, so psalms is plural, psalm is singular, right? So if you're going to Psalm 51, you wouldn't pluralize that. But so there are lament psalms. What's a lament? A cry out, yeah. And sometimes a petition. So there are psalms sprinkled throughout the Psalter, right? Psalter is just another word, that's with a P, not like you're going to salt your food. The Psalter, if you want to be super fancy, you can throw that out at your next Christmas party. There are various kinds of psalms within the Psalter that are lament psalms. They are crying out to God. They are petitions. They would be similar to what we might see coming from Job. They're similar to what we might see in, Lamentations, right? The whole book of lamenting. And so it's important to kind of, as you look at that, there are psalms that are coming out and rising out of desperation. This is why we love the Psalms, because there are so many different kinds. And what the Psalms do, and we're going to see this, I'm going to break down Psalm 1 here in a second, and it'll frame up, because Psalm 1 is arguably, it's like the doorway to the entire Psalter, right? So it's kind of like the main gate where you're going to walk through, and it's going to help set up for the rest of the Psalms. But you have lament psalms. You have the second one, which are called hymns. Hymns. Specifically, hymns are explaining and praising God's greatness. If you are in seminary, all of these will be on your test. Let me just throw that out there for you. Looking at you, Sloaney. Okay, you got it all right here? What's the next one I'm going to say? Okay. I'm watching you. I'm going to grade yours extra hard. God's greatness. Okay, you'll grade his. That's great. Oh, man. That's community at its finest. All right. Third, enthronement. Okay, enthronement psalms. These celebrate Yahweh as king, specifically. All right, so one talks about God's greatness. Those are hymns, and those are more general. But enthronements are going to be royal. All right, well, don't say royal, because that's a whole nother psalm. But celebrate Yahweh as king, because the next one are actually called royal psalms. Anybody know what a royal psalm is? Explain the Kansas City Royals. You got it? Not quite. Because that would be still more enthronement. Not necessarily. These talk about, you could say, the King of Kings. Typically, they're messianic. They're talking about the Messiah. So there are many psalms that are quoted in the New Testament that talk about the coming Messiah. Those would be classified as royal psalms, which would delineate it and distinguish it between enthronement psalms. Zion. So Zion is kind of psalms about Zion, or I don't know if Zionic's a word. That seems weird, but Zion psalms. What is Zion? Jerusalem, right? Thank you. Yeah, you got the saints of Zion. That's a different kind of Zion, right? So, but this Zion, anytime you see Zion throughout the prophets and the writings, we're talking about Jerusalem. All right, so Jerusalem as the place of worship. So you got to think when these Zion psalms are coming through, they're talking about this place of worship that they have, because that was where God dwelt. Think of, it would be almost like, it's obviously for Israel, think of like Washington, D.C. or the White House being restored or something like that, right? That is getting into far too many politics, all right? We're not going that direction. But just from our understanding, that's why they would be talking about Zion, because if there's a reform, say, in a symbolic way, if we were writing about poetry and we say there was a reform in the White House, we would naturally think that would begin to affect all of the United States. That's why they begin to talk about Zion, because if there's a reform in Zion, they're talking about a reform for the whole state of Israel, like that, okay? Again, I'm not going politics. I'm just saying this is just to help make an analogy. Then there are didactic psalms. Didactic psalms. D-I-D-A-C-T-I-C. Didactic. What does didactic mean? Teaching, that's right. You would know one of the early, right after the New Testament was written, one of the earliest documents that we have from the early church is a document called the Didache, which are the teachings. And so the didactic Psalms, they teach us about God, or they teach us about, they instruct us in the law, stuff like that. Okay? And then, yes. Yes. Yeah. It's one of the categories because they're specific to Jerusalem and its Reformation usually. And then the last one, and these are the ones that we really love to preach, these are called imprecatory Psalms. Imprecatory, Impreccatory. Imprec. I think there's two C's. There might only be one C. Imprecatory. 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 What is to make an imprecation on something or someone? To curse them, right? We love these psalms. That's why I was kidding when we said it. All right, so an imprecatory psalm is basically, God, come down and do your justice. God, come down and destroy the wicked. So Psalm 37 is a famous imprecatory psalm. I think it's Psalm 37. It could be another one. Maybe it's 137. I'd have to go back and look. But there's a psalm, it's either 37 or 137. I think 137 sounded more promising, where the psalmist basically says, I wish that we would come to Babylon and dash their children against the rocks, right? Right. Okay, so all of a sudden we're like, oh, I love the Psalms. They're my favorite Psalms, right? And so then this is the one you read before the entire congregation, and you get before them, and you're just like, man, I just love the Psalms. I think it's 137, or 137, 134. What? 137, Lament of the Exiles. Yeah, so I did a summer in the Psalms at midweek 2 summers ago, and I preached on this psalm. Just because I've never heard it preached before. But you have the Lament of the Exiles. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites said that day? At Jerusalem, destroy it, down its foundations. This is verse 8. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who pays you back what you have done to us. Verse 9. Happy is he who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rocks. Amen, right? Everyone said. So, imprecatory Psalms, where we go, all right, is we have to figure out the context. This is actually one of the saddest Psalms in the entire Psalter. When Psalm 137, you hear, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept as we remembered Zion. These are haunting words. These are a people who are in exile, who've been kicked out of their land, and as they sit down and are remembering the way that they used to be under the providence and provision of God, they are crying out to God. There we hung up our lyres on the poplar trees. Poplar trees are, that wasn't a part of the nation of Israel. They know that they're in a foreign land, and they're setting aside their instruments of celebration. And then verse 3, for our captors there asked us for songs, and our tormentors for rejoicing. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. What are they doing? The enemy is taunting them as they're in a foreign land, looking upon theirs, weeping because they know the sin that is ever before them. And you have these people who are utterly broken. How can we sing the Lord's song on foreign soil? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not exalt Jerusalem as my greatest joy. Why? Because Jerusalem was the very presence of God among the people. It had been ransacked. It had been destroyed. They're God's people in a foreign land getting made fun of for following Yahweh, and they are lamenting and crying out to God. All the while, that Zion and lament then turn into an imprecation. Lord, remember your justice. Remember your people. And in this sort of explosion of emotion, happy is the one who dashes their children against the rocks for what they've done to us. And if you know about Babylon, that was mild compared to what Babylon had done to the people it had destroyed. And you see this. So imprecation, we don't like to preach them, but honestly, there are some injustices in the world that we can come up against, and all we can do is, Lord, may your justice roll, as it says in Amos. May your justice come down. May you be king over all things. That's the kind of words that we get from imprecatory psalms. If we talk about authorship, switching total gears, but it's written by various authors. Really, 73 of the 150 psalms, so almost half of the psalms, are attributed to David. Many others are attributed to Solomon. So David and Solomon kind of take the cake on the majority of them. And then you have a few others. You have the sons of Korah, Asaph, Heman, Ethan, and a few that are attributed to Moses. And so just know that kind of the majority of them are Solomon and David. And then you have a sprinkling of a few others, which also actually helps us understand that it's a collection of these psalms, which doesn't invalidate its inerrancy. It actually kind of makes it that much more beautiful. So they were used and compiled for Israelite liturgy. What is liturgy? Anybody come from a more liturgical background? Liturgy, what is it? Ideas, phrases, and observances that are used in worship, right? So you can do liturgical practices. If you go to an Anglican church or Catholic church, they're going to use different things in their worship. They're going to incorporate different things in the worship that they do every worship, right? They're going to say the Apostles' Creed or something like that. Those are elements of liturgy. The Psalms were used in corporate worship for Israel to use as liturgy. I think for time's sake, I won't necessarily break down Psalm 1. I'll send you guys a link to especially Psalm 1 and 2. If you guys are interested, I preached on that a couple summers ago. That might help you give framework. But Psalm 1, you have to think of it as, this is what I'll say about this. So you have to think of it as the entry point and the gatekeeper to the rest of the Psalms. And so it actually is really nice. So blessed is the one, or blessed is the, our translation from the CSB, if you go to Psalm chapter 1, says how happy. Happy is the one. And let's see. How happy is the one who does not walk in the advice of the wicked, or stand in the pathway of sinners, or sit in the company of mockers. Instead, his delight is in the Lord's instruction, and he meditates on it day and night. He is like a tree planted beside flowing streams that bears its fruit in its season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. The wicked are not like this. Instead, they are like the chaff that blows that the wind blows away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand up in judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to ruin. There are several things that are introduced here, but let me just go over a couple. Number one, there are two ways. There are two paths. There's not a middle ground. There's not anything. There is the path of the righteous, and there's the path of the wicked. Psalms makes it clear. And Proverbs is going to pick up on the same idea, right? You see in Proverbs, you have the Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly that we'll see here in a second. But you have the way of the righteous and you have the way of the wicked. When it comes to the Psalms, what Psalm 1 helps us do, how happy is the one who does these things. It sets us up to understand the Psalms as those who are delighting in God, what are proper emotions for those kind of people. For those people, these happy ones who aren't sitting around the wicked or standing in the pathway of sinners or sitting in the company of mockers, for those people who aren't doing that, but instead they are delighting in the Lord's law, what kinds of emotions are appropriate? What are the human responses to a variety of situations for people who are the blessed ones, for people who are happy, for people who are delighting in the Lord? And so the Psalms are God's infallible way to preserve man's response to a variety of situations in the most appropriate and God-honoring and praiseworthy way. Which is why you can go to the Psalms when you're mad. You can go to the Psalms when you're sad. You can go to the Psalms when you're happy. You can go to the Psalms when you're frustrated. You can go to the Psalms for all of those emotions, and you can find various Psalms that offer us hope and direction and the path of righteousness, because that's what the Psalms are intended to do. How happy is the one who's not doing those things but delighting in the Lord, and let me show you that path. Let me show you what that looks like. That's helpful for us. That's why I'm sure if we went around the room and we asked you, what is your favorite Psalm? That favorite Psalm would often be associated with the time in your life where you were going through something. Many times. It caused you to remember the Lord. It caused you to remember his goodness, his greatness. It caused you to remember his promises. It caused you to remember that it's okay to cry. All of those things. When you ask somebody, and that's why as believers we can come together and we'll all have different psalms because of a various time. Ask my wife. She's got it, and I'm pretty sure, I'll have to quote her on this, I think it's Psalm 73. Because she went through something and she just remembers it. That's been her psalm. Psalm 51 has been really helpful in my life. We went over that with David and Bathsheba. Just a call to repentance is important. Psalm 63 has been a huge one in my life because you get this picture of this David who's out in the wilderness and he is thirsty and he is starving and he desires this food and water, and he says, but it's you, God, who are what I long for. It's you, God, who will satisfy the inner parts of my soul. It's not all the desert wasteland that's around me, regardless of that, regardless that I actually need a drink, regardless that I actually need food. You are my sustenance and you are my salvation. And we can just go, we can do this. We can go around, and each time it's going to call us to something different. That's the beauty of the Psalms. And I'm thankful for the Psalms because of that. And so Psalm 1 helps us understand, I would say, the rest of the Psalter. Let's see. I had a whole sermon on that one that I was just about to do, and you guys cut me short on that. Thanks for that. Any questions on the Psalms? Good? Do y'all need a break? I know you guys ate. It's warm in here? Feel warm in here? It's a little warm in here. I'll text facilities. Okay. Yeah, I don't know why I'm trying to convince myself that it's warm in here. I'm hot. All right, so 5 minutes. That's what you got. That's all you got. All right, if you need more food, need a refill, I want you to come back looking a little bit more lively than you are right now. Some of you guys fell asleep. You're like, I had one chicken wing too many. I get it, but the Lord is watching you. Yep. Yeah, so if you know who they are, it says it at the top. A Psalm of David or a Psalm of Solomon. There are also some just anonymous ones where some scholars, what they'll do is based on how it's written, they'll then, this is the same thing they do with like authorship of New Testament books. So there's nobody knows who wrote the book of Hebrews, just as one example. So when we get to the book of Hebrews, we don't really have an author, doesn't introduce himself. But some will speculate and say that was Paul because it's written just like his other letters or stuff like that. That's how they would do the Psalms as well. The Psalms, this one looks like a Davidic psalm because it was written with similar vocabulary, similar style. You know, all writers have different styles, and so that's how they do it. And that's how they do New Testament books. You know, some would say Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, isn't enough to claim authorship on a Galatians or Ephesians or Philippians, Colossians. So then they'll argue about the authorship. And sometimes I just wonder if they just don't have anything better to do. Other times they're really trying to say, no, this was actually written by a pseudo-Paul or something like that. That's a higher criticism, higher critical stuff. But everybody's trying to get down to, is the language consistent? So. Yeah. There's one passage, that actually Dr. Lasser brought out as well. There's one passage that seems contradictory, and he explains it pretty well in that when he's talking about Proverbs in particular. With the Psalms, typically that's not the pushback for the Psalms. There's only that one proverb. This actually helps us go into Proverbs. So if we begin to kind of think through Proverbs are, they are kind of short little pithy statements on wisdom. The bigger problem with Proverbs is that Proverbs is just that. They are principles of wisdom. They are not, and I cannot be more clear, they are not promises. And that's a big difference, right? So you go to the famous passage that I had hanging in my room. It was a picture of a train, right? And it was, train up your child in the way that he should go. And then, what's the rest of it? Train up a child in the way he should go, and they will not go astray. They will not depart from it. Right, so I had a train, and I used to think that passage was about trains. Like, I did not get it. Like, I'm not kidding, until I was like 15. It wasn't still hanging in my room at that point. But, I just remember thinking on that, and I'm going, train up the child in the way he should go, and it won't depart from it. Why is there a picture of a train? Like, I mean, but then you think about a path or something like that. But people they've read that verse, they said, I did everything I could to train him up in the way of the Lord, and my child went astray like a prodigal. It's a principle of wisdom. It's not a promise. Is it wise to train up a child in the way of the Lord? Yes. Okay? Is it a guarantee that your kid's not going to end up a prodigal? No. Right? And so we have to remember that and that's just one example, but the Proverbs in particular are principles for wisdom, not promises of God. And that doesn't negate their inerrancy. That doesn't negate their truth. That shows you what's the wise way of living in particular ways. Growing up, I had a problem with Proverbs, actually. So I didn't quite know what to do with them. Right? There wasn't a story involved. It seems like sort of God's random thoughts. It was like, now we would call it like God's Twitter or something like that. He's like, boom, got him on this one. I've had to fit under 148 characters or whatever. And so that's kind of the way I thought of it. Just growing up, obviously not Twitter, but just this idea of God's random thoughts. And I didn't know, right? So wisdom literature, I didn't know that wisdom literature matched with the gospel. That God forgives you through his son Jesus, and your salvation is not dependent upon your works, but upon God's grace. So there was a disconnect between reading what Proverbs says and then reading through the Gospels, right? Because the Gospels say that you're saved by what? By grace, through faith in Jesus. Proverbs, it seems to say, well, this is the way you should act. And there almost seemed to be a disconnect between the two, like this was presenting some kind of moralism, and then you had the gospel over here in the New Testament. And it was hard for me. I just remember growing up that way. And the way that I heard Proverbs preached and taught very rarely referenced Christ. And that did a disservice, I think, to it. You might have a few one-off little comments about Jesus, but typically it was just this wisdom-filled life that was void of Christ. That if you were in the room even at times and you heard somebody preach that passage, you could walk out as a believer, you could walk out as a Muslim, you could walk out, and you could just walk out of that as more of like a motivational type speech than you might actually walk out as a gospel-driven and gospel-centered message. And that's why I had a big problem with Proverbs.